Today, I'm going to be talking about the one thing that separates you from a pro player. And no, it's not your mechanics, your aim, or even your game sense. There's one thing that every pro player does differently that allows them to improve at a completely different rate than the average player. And the crazy part is, this same thing can be applied to pretty much anything in life if you use it correctly. So if you actually want to improve at Fortnite or get better at anything you do, this is something you need to understand. Now, what is the one thing that they have that you don't? And it's not zero ping, not 500 FPS, or even zero delay, even though all that stuff does help them stay at the top. It's not their raw talent or their very specific routines. And the funny thing is, most of you guys are probably healthier and or physically and mentally better off than most Fortnite pros. Well, so what is it? It's obsession. See, Fortnite pros have to be obsessed with the game, or be obsessed with the game for a long period of time at some point that got them to the level that they are at today. A lot of you guys say you're obsessed, but tend to just play the game to escape your reality. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's actually a good thing if that's what you need it to be, as long as it doesn't distract you from bettering your own life. But once again, you guys are obsessed with the wrong things inside of Fortnite. So what should you be obsessed with in Fortnite? And I think this is where a lot of people misunderstand what I mean when I say obsession. Because when most people hear the word obsessed, they think of the recent movie, but they automatically think about someone who is playing the game for 8, 10, or even 12 hours every single day. But that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. You can play Fortnite for 10 hours a day and barely improve, while someone else can play for 3 hours and improve significantly more than you. The amount of time you spend doing something doesn't automatically determine how much you improve at it. Sometimes doing too much can actually make you worse at the game, or anything in life. What matters is what you're actually doing with that time and what you're thinking about while you're doing it. Think about it like this: if you played soccer or football for the rest of the world every single day, but never thought about your positioning, never worked on your weaknesses, never looked at why you were losing the ball, missing shots, or getting beat by their offense, and you just played pickup games for hours, you would definitely gain some experience. But would you improve as quickly as someone who spent part of their time specifically working on their weaknesses and analyzing their mistakes? Probably not. You could play for hundreds of hours, but if you never actually stop to understand what you're doing wrong, you just keep repeating the same mistakes. And Fortnite is no different. When you're actually obsessed with improving, you start looking at the game differently. You don't just die and think, oh, I died. You start asking yourself, why did I die? Just like a soccer player might ask why they lost possession or got caught out of position. You start breaking down exactly what went wrong in your gameplay. You start thinking about whether your crosshair placement was bad, whether you rushed an edit, whether you exposed yourself too much, whether you took the wrong peek, whether your movement was too predictable, or whether you simply weren't prepared for what the other player did. And just like a soccer player can watch their games back and recognize mistakes in their positioning or decision making, you can look back at your Fortnite gameplay and figure out exactly where you went wrong. Eventually, this becomes automatic. You start turning your normal gameplay into a learning experience where every death, every missed shot, and every lost fight gives you something to improve on. That's what separates someone who simply plays Fortnite with someone who is genuinely obsessed with getting better at it. But before I get into that, let's talk about consistency. Because if you look at almost anyone who becomes great at something, obsession and consistency tend to go hand in hand. When you're genuinely obsessed with getting better, you don't need to constantly force yourself to practice. You actually want to, and that's where consistency comes from. Because think about it, the difference between someone who practices because they feel like they have to, and someone who practices because they genuinely want to know how good they can become, the first person might practice for a week, get bored, miss a day, miss another day, and eventually stop. The second person might have a bad day and still want to get back on tomorrow because they're thinking about what went wrong that day. That's a huge difference, and I'm not saying you should completely sacrifice your life for Fortnite either. You shouldn't stop going to school, stop working, stop exercising, stop spending time with your friends, or stop taking care of yourself just because you want to become a Fortnite pro. If anything, becoming obsessed with improvement should make you better at managing your life overall, because you should be trying to optimize everything that helps you perform. The goal isn't to become obsessed with just playing Fortnite, the goal is to become obsessed with becoming better in every aspect of your life. Now, I want to break this down even further. I'm going to give you 4 separate hypothetical players, and I want you to comment down below which one of them has the most potential to go pro. Now, I want to preface that none of these players are gifted with talent off the start like most pro players are. They're just average players that want to go pro, a lot like a lot of you guys watching this video. And I want you to actually think about this before I give you the answer, because I think the answer is going to be a little bit different than what some of you guys expect. Because if you just look at the amount of hours each player is playing, you might automatically choose one of the players playing for 4 hours every day. But that's exactly why I made these 4 players. I'm not asking you who is playing the most. I'm asking you who is most likely to improve the fastest. Those are 2 completely different questions. Okay, first option A. This player gets on the game and plays for 4 hours. Now, they play 4 hours every single day, but their average day on the game tends to be about 2 hours of reload or even ranked reload with friends, and then playing random creative maps to either fight people casually or just try to have fun. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this player. In fact, this is probably how most people play Fortnite. They get on, play some games, have fun with friends, maybe hit some creative for a little bit, and then get off. And if your goal is to simply have fun, that is completely fine. The problem is that the player that wants to become a professional player, and that's where the issue starts, because imagine doing this for an entire year. You're playing 4 hours every single day, which is over 1,000 hours in a year. That sounds like an insane amount of practice, but how much of that time was actually spent improving your weaknesses? How much of it was spent analyzing your mistakes? How much of it was deliberately practicing something you were bad at? And how much of it was just playing the same way you've always played? That's the problem. You can repeat the same habits for thousands of hours, and if those habits are bad, you're just becoming really good at repeating bad habits. That is something that people don't understand about practice. Practice doesn't automatically make perfect. Practice makes permanent. If you practice the wrong thing over and over again, you actually make the wrong thing harder to fix later. So this player is consistent, but consistency by itself isn't enough. Okay, option B. This player gets on the game and starts their 3-hour session with 30 minutes of a planned routine based on the previous day's weaknesses. After their isolated drills, part of their routine, they hop into a creative map to transfer those isolated drills into real game practice. Once they do that, they play 2 games of ranked reload, not for fun, but to improve their overall abilities in game. And then they go to 2 ranked BR matches and 1 to 2 scrims depending on the amount of time they have left. But this player is not obsessed. They're just doing it to get better. And honestly, this player is already doing a lot of things right. They're looking at their previous performance, identifying the weaknesses, creating drills specifically for those weaknesses, taking those drills into actual gameplay, and then testing themselves in competitive environments. This is so much closer to what I would want someone who genuinely wants to go pro to be doing. They're not wasting their entire session just playing whatever they feel like. They have a reason for getting on, they know what they're trying to improve, and they have an entire process built for it. But there's still something missing. Let's say this player finishes their 3-hour session. They get off of Fortnite and don't think about it again until the next day. They aren't analyzing their games outside of their routine. They aren't thinking about the mistakes they made while they're eating dinner. They aren't watching a pro player and thinking about how they can implement something into their own gameplay. They aren't thinking about how they could have played the endgame differently. They're simply following their routine, and again, there's nothing wrong with that. This player could become very good, but compared to someone who is both structured and obsessed, they're missing that extra level of mental investment. Okay, option C. This player is the same as option A, but the only difference is that they're obsessed with it. They constantly think back on their reload games even when they aren't on the game, and they're looking for ways to improve throughout their 4-hour reload session. And this is where things start to get interesting, because even though option C doesn't have the structured routine of option B, their obsession can cause them to naturally start learning from the game. Let's say they lose a fight in reload. Instead of just saying that guy was better, they start thinking about what happened. Maybe they realize they kept taking the same right-hand peek. Maybe they noticed they're way too predictable. Maybe they realized they were rushing edits because they were nervous. Maybe they recognized that they weren't paying attention to the opponent's positioning. And then the next time they're in that situation, they remember it. That is learning. And the more obsessed they become with improving, the more often this actually happens. They start noticing patterns, they start remembering situations, they start understanding what separates their good games from their bad games. They might even find themselves thinking about Fortnite when they're not playing. Maybe they're watching a tournament and suddenly realize, wait, that pro just did something I never do. Then the next time they get on, they try it. That's incredibly valuable, but there's still a major problem with option C. They're not necessarily directing their obsession. They might be thinking about Fortnite constantly, but that doesn't guarantee that they're thinking about the right things. They could be spending 4 hours still practicing something they're already good at. They could be playing the same game mode over and over again because it's fun. They could be obsessed with winning fights instead of fixing the reason they're losing them. So obsession gives them a huge advantage, but without structure, that obsession can be inefficient. And finally, option D, the last player. This player is the same as option B with the same structured routine and time played, but they're obsessed with getting better and or just the game in general. They're not just playing, they're not just practicing, they're not just thinking. They're doing all three. They go on and they already know what they're trying to improve. They've identified weaknesses from previous sessions, they isolate those weaknesses, practice them, transfer them into creative, test them in ranked reload, test them again in ranked battle royale, and take them into scrims. And when they're done, they're still thinking about the game, thinking about what went wrong, what went right, and what they need to work on tomorrow. That's a completely different level of improvement. Now I want you guys to think about this for a second. If all 4 players started as completely average players and all 4 genuinely wanted to become professional, who do you think would have the highest chance of getting there? Now based on all these options, which 2 do you think will improve the fastest or have the most likely chances of going pro? Well, in all honesty, pause the video right now and comment which one you think it will be down below, because I don't want you guys to just hear my answer. I want you to actually think about it. Who would you rather be? The player putting in 4 hours every day, the player with perfect routine, the player who thinks about Fortnite constantly, or the player who combines them all? Now, here's what would most likely happen with these 4 players. Number 4, option A. This player is probably going to improve the slowest, and again, that doesn't mean they're bad. They're actually putting in 4 hours every single day, which is more than option B. The problem is that time played doesn't automatically equal productive practice. They're getting experience, but they're not deliberately attacking their weaknesses. They'll probably improve naturally because they're playing so much, but eventually they're going to hit a wall. They'll make the same mistakes, lose fights in the same situations, and struggle against better players without understanding why. This is the player who says, I played Fortnite for 5,000 hours. Why am I not as good as a pro? And the answer isn't necessarily that they need another 5,000 hours. They might need to change what they're doing with those hours. Okay, Number 3 would be option B. This player is going to improve much faster. They're deliberately working on weaknesses, using isolated drills, transferring those drills into real gameplay, playing competitive modes and scrims, and reviewing their performances. So even though they're playing less than option A, their 3 hours are probably much more productive. You don't necessarily need to play more, you need to make the time you already have valuable. But there's still something missing. They're following the routine, but they're not obsessed with improvement. Once their practice session ends, they're done. They're not constantly thinking about what they could have done better, and that puts them below option C. And honestly, these two are probably interchangeable because they'd probably get the same amount of improvement. Now, number 2 would be option C. This player is extremely motivated. They're thinking about Fortnite constantly, remembering their mistakes, analyzing their fights, watching other players, and thinking about what they could have done differently. That mental engagement is powerful because even when they're not physically practicing, they're still thinking about the actual skills itself. But their biggest weakness is that they don't have structure. They know they want to improve, but they don't always know exactly what they should be practicing. You can be obsessed with getting better and still be very inefficient. You could spend 4 hours grinding edits when your biggest weakness is decision making, or spending hundreds of hours playing reload when what you really need is more battle royale and scrim experience. So option C is still powerful, but their obsession isn't always being directed toward the area that give them the biggest improvement. And that brings us to the number 1 spot, which would obviously be option D. This is the player I'd expect to improve the fastest. They have the structure of option B and the obsession of option C. They're deliberately practicing their weaknesses, but they're also constantly thinking about the game. They're not just completing a routine because someone told them to. They actually care about understanding what they're doing wrong and how they can fix it. This creates what I would call high quality volume. They're still getting their hours in, but they're getting significantly more value out of every hour. And this is something I really want you to understand. There are 2 different ways you can spend 1,000 hours. You can spend 1,000 hours simply doing something, or you can spend 1,000 hours deliberately trying to become better at it. Those are not the same thing. The first person might have 1,000 hours of experience. The second person has the experience plus analysis, correction, adaptation, and deliberate practice. Over time, that gap becomes massive. That's why some players can have thousands of hours and still feel stuck. They aren't necessarily lazy, they might actually be working incredibly hard, they're just not directing that work toward what matters most. And that's why obsession is so important. When you're obsessed with improvement, you start asking better questions instead of asking how many hours should I play today. You ask what should I actually accomplish today. Instead of saying why am I losing, you ask what specifically caused me to lose. Is it aim, movement, piece control, timing, decision making, positioning, nerves, even my confidence? Because once you identify the actual problem, you can actually fix it. But being obsessed doesn't mean playing Fortnite all day or hating yourself every time you lose once again. Real obsession with improvement means caring enough about getting better that you're willing to do what actually helps you. Maybe you're exhausted, maybe you're tilted, maybe you haven't slept enough. Sometimes the best thing you can do for improvement is get off the game and come back focused. That's why I always tell you before long periods of grinding sessions, like if you're trying to go pro and you're practicing constantly for a month, take a couple days off before it. Your sleep, health, focus, practice, and recovery all affect how effectively you learn. So don't take this video as me saying, go play Fortnite all day. Don't go do anything else. The message is to change the way you think about improvement. Even if you only have 3 hours a day, you can make those 3 hours incredibly valuable. Get on with a purpose, identify a weakness, practice it, test it in real games, analyze what happened, then come back tomorrow and repeat the process. That's consistency, and when you actually start enjoying that process, that's obsession. You start enjoying fixing things you were bad at, becoming faster, beating players who used to destroy you, and looking months later and realizing how much you improved. That's the difference between being addicted to playing Fortnite and being addicted to becoming better at Fortnite. So the next time you get on, don't just ask yourself, how long am I going to play today? Ask yourself, what am I going to be better at when I get off? Because when you combine obsession with consistency and deliberately direct that obsession towards improvement, that's when you start improving at a completely different rate. So fast, it actually feels like cheating. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps me out a ton. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subs by the end of the year. And if you want to support me even more, use code FLOWSTIDE in the Fortnite item shop. If you want a more structured routine in Fortnite, click on this video right here on the screen. Thank you for taking time out of your day to watch my video. I really appreciate it. Join my new Discord channel down below. It's a community server, and I hope I opened up your guys' eyes to what real improvement actually looks like. You guys have a great rest of your guys' day, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace, guys.